Colleagues, welcome. Thank you for being prompt at the beginning of the hour. We're with the Good Growth Conference, Integrated Supply Chain Approach Helping to Achieve Systems Change, our finale panel with the leaders of the Good Growth Partnership giving us their wisdom. We'll start in a couple of minutes while everybody joins. Colleagues, thank you for joining. You're joining us at the Good Growth Conference, the finale high-level panel event. We'll just wait a couple more minutes before we get going. Colleagues, thank you for joining us here at the Good Growth Conference, initiative of the Good Growth Partnership, supported through funding from the Global Environment Facility and the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes' time when everybody's joined. All our panelists are here and waiting to give you their wisdom. And we look forward to a tightly packed hour of information, opinion and learning. So colleagues, if you've just joined us, we're just waiting for everyone to click into the Zoom link. All of our panel are here and ready to speak. I'm Simon Cooper, the communications lead for the Food and Agricultural Commodities Systems practice of UNDP. And I'm going to be your host as we go through this hour talking to the leaders from the Good Growth Partnership. So we'll start in 30 seconds time. I always feel this should be a Zoom starting gun of some kind that we should fire to let us get going. So let's start now. I think we have our colleagues joining us, and no doubt more will as the clock ticks around from the top of the hour. So welcome to our conference finale high-level panel event, how the integrated supply chain approach can help achieve systems change. And we have for the next hour the leaders of the Good Growth Partnership discussing tackling deforestation from commodity supply chains. Well, as you know, the Good Growth Conference is an initiative of the Good Growth Partnership, supported through funding from the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, and the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. It's convened by UNDP in collaboration with Conservation International, the International Finance Corporation, UN Environment, and the World Wildlife Fund. And we've got leaders from all of these partners with us today. The GGP is a flagship global initiative working across production, financing, and demand. It convenes a wide range of stakeholders and adopts an integrated approach to accelerate progress towards sector-wide transformation. During this panel, the challenges, lessons, and solutions to sustainably transform agricultural supply chains will be explored, building on what we've experienced in the GGP over the last 4 years. I'll be inviting our leaders to share their thoughts and key insights on the value of taking the integrated supply chain approach to tackling deforestation from agricultural commodity supply chains. And we'll conclude towards the end of the hour talking about the future and what's needed to take this approach to the next level. Well, we have, as I said, a wide range of leaders here. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, CEO and chairperson at the Global Environment Facility. He's been there since June 2020. So not much happening, Carlos, since then for you to have to deal with. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. His prior experience was the Minister of Environment Energy in Costa Rica, where he had a 3-term mandate. Also Vice President for Global Policy at Conservation International for 12 years. And director of Costa Rica's National Parks Service in the early 1990s. And when we see him full screen, you'll see he's got an example of the national parks in Costa Rica on the background behind him. Ulrika Modea is Assistant Administrator and Director of the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy for UNDP. She's been there since 2018, and her work focuses on nurturing and growing key relationships with member states and new and emerging partners on advocacy to achieve the SDGs. In previous roles, she's been Sweden's State Secretary for International Development, Cooperation and Climate, helping to reshape the country's international development cooperation in support of the 2030 Agenda. So on to the Ggp partners themselves. We have Sanjayan joining us, M. Sanjayan, who's CEO at Conservation International, been there since 2017 as CEO, but joined in 2014. As a global conservation scientist, his work spans from genetics to wildlife migration to nature's impacts on human well-being. Nick Sekran is with us. He's Chief Conservation Officer at WWF since early 2021, early this year, with 20 years experience in conservation and development in over 45 countries. Previously, he's been Director for Sustainable Development at UNDP and worked with the GEF, was Chair of the Steering Group and Executive Board of the UN RED Programme. Tanya Lozansky, Senior Manager at IFC for Manufacturing, Agribusiness and Services sectors based in Nairobi. Her work focuses on private companies in emerging markets to improve productivity, promote sustainable and efficient practices through supply chains, and unlock new market opportunities for private investment. And Eric Usher, head of the UN Environment Finance Initiative, has a 25-year experience in the sustainable energy and finance sectors, prior experience at UNEP, responsible for program portfolio advancing new public and private instruments for financing cleaner energy infrastructure. He worked on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change on the development of the Green Climate Fund. I can assure you everybody has a far longer biography than that, so apologies if I've edited out something that was really important to you, but I think that gives an indication of the quality of the panel that we have here. Interpretation is available. If you'd like to hear what we're doing in Spanish, down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a globe on the right-hand side with interpretation written underneath it. Click on that and you'll be able to hear the proceedings in Spanish. Later on, we'll be taking questions from you, the audience. My colleague Pascal Bonzom, Global Project Manager of the Good Growth Partnership, will be putting your questions to the panel. So as the session progresses, next door to the interpretation globe, you'll see a Q&A button. Please do put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll select those as we get to towards the end of the hour. And please do put questions in as they occur to you or the panelists are speaking, because we'll need to get promptly onto the question and answer session when we get to that. So I've described everybody involved, all the dramatis personae. If we need the wisdom of the crowd, then I think you'll agree this is a very wise and experienced crowd. So let's move into discussion. First question is, what key success and impact has Ggp achieved to date? And what's the Ggp taught us about the value of taking this integrated approach to tackling deforestation from commodities supply chains? And I'd like to ask Ulrika Modea to pick up that question first of all. Ulrika, over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, all of you listening into this. I mean, I find it fascinating as I look at what the partnership has achieved, and I also find that this is the way we need to work onwards. So you would know that UNDP as an agency is one of the funds and programs of the United Nations that has a broad mandate ranging from addressing poverty and increasing poverty as we know it, increasing inequalities as well, towards governance, rule of law, human rights, but then also we have a really high number of projects and programs on the ground in the field of environment and climate change, and we're working in many conflict-ridden settings. With all this said, we have been given as an agency a role to look for integrated solutions and system solutions. And of course, this partnership is a perfect example of this. And I would also like to say that partnerships is really the new leadership that we need to showcase how we can do things differently if we are to go forward instead of reverse, as our latest human development report has told us now, as we're looking at the impact of the socioeconomic effects of the pandemic that will accompany countries and communities for such a long time. But to go back to the partnership, what the partnership is addressing then is, of course, as you were alluding to, Simon, the system solutions and the integrated solutions. I mean, to attempts to curb deforestation from commodities production have as a lot of you on this call know, worked many times in silos, the production side, the demand side, and the finance side, working in their bubbles. Great work many times, but too many times disconnected. And I think that this is what the partnership has found and is trying to address, how we can work, as you were saying, with production, demand, and finance together in different ways. This, of course, takes new ways of working, where we're looking at a whole of government and whole of society approach. And of course, here's also where UNDP can come in with our assets into the partnership with regard to governance, but also working with a wider range of actors together with other colleagues in the partnerships. Looking at how we can get the right policies in place that relates, of course, to the government structures, the decentralized structures at regional, local level, but also, of course, the policies that need to be in place to get the finance to work and the private sector also to be part of this, and civil society as well. How we can also see to that these policies are the right policies to get that responsible finance, but also the attractive financial products, because we would know that many times to drive these kind of investments, it's the lack of really attractive financial products that is also the case. We need, of course, to look at jurisdictions, geographies, and make that multi-stakeholder collaboration to work. And I think that this is what we have seen a number of examples of. So let me just give some few examples very quickly and get back then later on. I mean, we've seen success in the program in Indonesia, working on palm oil, where we have worked together with government, and we have really found a way to, as UNDP, also to penetrate the higher levels of government, getting then ministries to work together. In total, 14 ministries and governance, regions and mayors are playing a role in this implementation of this program, benefiting 2.6 million smallholder farmers in Indonesia. And working in a new and different way. In Liberia, another example, also on palm oil, where we see change makers from more than 46 organizations from both public, private, and civil society working together with a new all-encompassing strategy that makes the results so much more sustainable. And also examples from Paraguay in the cattle sector, a different sector where we have also addressed different aspects in the implementation of the good agriculture practices, looking at restoration of forests, but also looking at the social aspects, of course, coming back also to UNDP's role, where we worked with the communities, producers, women, youth, and children, but also then the local institutions, the municipalities, the state. So it's this whole of society approach that we see as a success factor in many of the examples that we've seen throughout the partnership. Yeah, I mean, I think also we have to mention, of course, that I think the partnership is bringing together a unique team of experts, advisors, and coordinators. The online knowledge platform, this is really, of course, how we should work with partnerships so that we can, as multilateral organizations, as a global community, really see to that these best practices that we see on the ground, while they can't be copied and pasted everywhere, they can certainly be an inspiration to others. So that online platform is really important. The active community of practitioners is another, I think, success of the partnership that we should put forward. And of course, then, I mean, communicating this in a way that makes it intriguing and that challenges also, but also really invites more to come on board and to see the importance of getting this part of our sustainable development goals right through a system approach and through integrated solutions. Very quick tour, and happy to come back. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you, Ulrika. Yes, it's 3 minutes each. That's a very compressed time to put everything across. Let's move on to M. Sanjayan, Chief Executive Officer of Conservation International. How does it look from your viewpoint?
Well, thank you, Simon, and thanks to the panelists and for you for inviting me to be here today. You know, several of your speakers in a previous panel today, we had the Deputy Minister of Liberia there. So let's talk about Liberia. You know, I got to go to Liberia with our colleagues from the GEF a couple of years ago. There's about 210,000 hectares of forest today that is standing there partly because of the Good Growth Partnership. It really could have been completely destroyed. But here's what I saw on the ground and really surprised me. So we went and visited with a palm oil company, and it's a decent company that's trying to do the right thing. But because of the limitations or the pressures that frankly we put on them about limiting deforestation and also their desire to continue to export that palm oil to Europe, they very much limited their footprint on the ground. So they were developing only a small fraction of the concession that they were essentially granted. So you walk into this forest, which looks sort of pristine from the air, but once you get inside, you start running into communities, into villages. Virtually every single one of them was essentially upset that jobs that were promised did not really materialize at scale. And then every few hundred meters we took, we found a charcoal burning operation. So, here we were thinking we're saving this forest with very good, thoughtful practices on deforestation and palm oil, but in reality, it was actually getting cut down for the lowest possible use in the most hard, back-breaking kind of work that you can imagine, chopped up for charcoal to be sold on the side of the road. No one really wants to do that kind of work, by the way. People do it out of complete desperation for energy or for income. Eventually, this company pulled out. They couldn't operate there anymore. But because of the Good Growth Partnership, because of colleagues in Liberia, some of whom mentioned here, we managed to step in, help bring another partner to the table, another company to the table, a local company in this case. And it has seemed to have stuck, at least for now, the idea that responsible land use planning will go hand in hand with the limitations that we would put on palm oil. My point in telling you the story is that these pathways to protecting the planet are never linear. And, the comment made previously about taking a holistic approach really has sunk in for me. I always thought it's commodities. If we can work to clean up the supply chain on individual commodities, ultimately we'll protect the place. I found out that you can have a perfectly quote unquote pure commodity, like maybe the coffee I'm drinking today, and still the forest could be burning. And I think we find the Good Growth Partnership squarely in the middle of this incredibly interesting but important dialogue between commodities and companies, between the nonprofit sector, between governments, in trying to make sure, yes, commodities are important and protecting that supply chain and cleaning it up is really important, but it has to also happen within the broader context of land use planning and conservation and inclusion of communities.
Great point. Thank you very much. Nick from WWF, what's the position from your view?
Thank you, Simon, and thank you to the Good Growth Partnership for the invitation today. Look, I think there have been a number of accomplishments. Let me cite one. The fact that the China Meat Association has subscribed to efforts to address impacts in the meat supply chain to Chinese consumers is, I think, really a key achievement, and they've been working with the Accountability Framework Initiative, and I think let's not undersell the importance of this, because the growth in commodity demand is coming largely today from emerging economies, and whether it's Brazil or it's China or it's Indonesia, we need to crack the solutions, the way forward in terms of addressing demand and ensuring that impacts are being addressed in those markets. I think if you step back a little bit and think about the focus of this initiative, we're trying to disrupt commodity trade with a view towards addressing the environmental impacts. Let's face it, there are billions of transactions that need to be disrupted, and it's incredibly complex. And so, if I may, I think one of the big outcomes of the Good Growth Partnership and all the work around the world through all the agencies involved has been learning about what works and what doesn't work. And there are unintended consequences, and Sanjan's just pointed to one very telling example in Liberia. Let me just reflect on one point, and that is data. You need data at multiple levels. Governments need data, producers need data, consumers need data, traders need data, banks need data, and so on and so forth. Most actors currently have access to averages when we're looking at data. And averages are okay. I produce an average amount of soybean, I have an average impact. But actually, the problem is that the impacts are asymmetric. They're very different from place to place. And if you're really trying to disrupt the system, you're going to need much more granular data than we currently have access to today. And that's a key point, which we need to mull on. It's arisen as a result of the work of the Good Growth Partnership. It's true also around traceability. Well, we've had the Trace platform. It's been successful in expanding the coverage of global trade and commodity supply chains. Several projects are stalling because of the data is not available in the format that is useful to them. And so this is something else that we need to look at. And when we look at data, it's about how we use big data, data analytics, artificial intelligence in novel ways to disrupt the system. Another key area to look at is finance. And there you've got different needs and different actors, from governments to banks to traders to seed companies. They all have different entry points in terms of mobilizing change in the system. The traders are laggards, yet we need to get them on board, but they work on really tight margins. So unless you can look at entering into forward contracts, with the major retailers they serve, they're not likely to be able to use them as means of disruption. So I'm going to stop there because I'm at 3 minutes, but I think on this vein, it's this sort of big lessons that we're learning around what it takes to disrupt these billions of transactions, where I think this program has been most successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Well, thank you for closing with finance, because we're going to move on now to Eric Usher from the UN Environment Finance Initiative. I think you've got your cue there, Eric, from what Nick said.
Thanks very much, Simon and Nick and everyone. Happy to be with you all. I think in terms of framing the wider context within the finance community, what we're seeing in the last couple of years, if I talk mostly about banks, but and first others as well, is that they are realizing the need to become more holistic, to Ulrika's comments. And the notion, leading up, initially when they think about sustainability, they think of risk, and then risk and opportunity. We hear about, stoking up the green finance, the green bonds, et cetera. But post 2015, really linked to the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, they've shifted to a notion of understanding impact of their financing. And once you start to aggregate impact, understanding how your financing aligns with certain objectives. And so understanding the big picture, understanding entire supply chains, commodity chains becomes much more critical. And a lot of that links to developments in the climate sphere, but more and more we start to see it in other areas like here as well, that you realize if you don't understand the industry, the clients that you're working with, if you can't be forward predictive on changes that are going to occur, either physical, climate or environmental or social changes, or transitional changes in terms of policy changes or technological changes, you can be basically find all of a sudden you're in a very poor position in terms of stranded assets, in terms of clients who are going bust and the like. So we are in the wider picture seeing a increased level of sophistication. We have the banks have launched these UN Principles for Responsible Banking 2 years ago. Today, 40% of global banking assets are signatories. And that requires them to put in place systems to understand impact and to start to set targets, business targets that align with certain societal objectives. So as we come into this space, we are seeing an increasing maturity to understand the wider set of issues that the other speakers have already mentioned. To some extent, it becomes adding in sort of a policy role to a commercial financial institution. They need to start to be predictive on what's going to happen in the future. So once again, I think looking at the notion of deforestation or commodity chains, it's shifting to the mode of not only saying, well, where are the risks, but really how are these changes, these chains going to be changing? So how are our clients going to be changing, and what role can we help to actually realize change? And I think we are seeing progress in that area. And in this cooperation here really is about bringing all the pieces together and helping the individual actors essentially scale up or tool up. So part of it, and to some of the suggestions, it is about new financial innovations. It is about having better capacity to be able to assess the state of the clients or the need of the clients. So the work that we have been doing, contributing here has been in the area of well, building capacities in terms of proof of concepts for new types of financial approaches, also putting in place sort of the critical environmental and social risk frameworks that need to be needed. And how do you really importantly take this from sort of one-off type transactions, which is the type of thing you do and then you put it in your CSR report, to something which really becomes all about the business. So it's kind of say, what does it mean for all of our lending to agriculture? It's not that we're going to do one or two of these transactions. We're actually going to apply this approach to everything that we do. It's a long, slow process, but we are seeing an increased sense of urgency. And I think there are a lot of other things that are taking place in terms of policy commitments stepping up, and also the risks, the impact of risks playing out in a commercial sense that really has the financial sector, I think, looking and willing to play a much more cooperative and transformative role. And I won't go into too much detail. We do have the Agri3 Fund, which was established with Rabobank, which has been putting resources into forest protection, sustainable agriculture, has some very high ambitions, and others like IFC have really, from the development finance side, played a really important role, and the relationship between public and private capital is key. I'll stop at that, Simon.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks for mentioning IFC. And over to Tanya. There's your cue.
Sure, thanks, Simon. Look, I can only echo everybody on the line to say that the ecosystem approach is the only way that this will work. And we have just started, right? Despite the successes, there's a long way to go. And because of the complexity that everybody spoke about, there's no silver bullet, right? There's no easy solution. And so the foundations that we've laid here, that's how we have to go, adapting commodity by commodity, country by country, but there's no silver bullet. At IFC, finance is our middle name, so we definitely look at the finance sector and what could be done, to further the points that Eric made. And I think for us, one of the key lessons and achievements also under the Good Growth Partnership was, how do we consistently make sustainability a business driver, right? How can we switch the mindset from a compliance mindset to something that's really good for my business? And the two things that I'm particularly happy about coming out of this endeavor was when we looked at the palm oil sector in Indonesia, right? The independent smallholder palm producers. What does it take for them to be both sustainable, but also more profitable, right? And through this engagement, they were able to do all the right things, right, with our pilots, but also demonstrate productivity improvements of 35%. Now that's something, right? That's real. That's income, that's livelihood. So once you have the business case, it becomes that much easier to also make it a business case throughout the value chain, including for the financial institutions, which we're now trying to do specifically in Indonesia. Similarly, for Paraguay beef sector, right, modeling appropriate beef intensification practices in Paraguay, we have now seen 40% productivity improvements, right? Can you do something in a different way, more sustainably, but also have it be better for your bottom line? And I think we have begun to document this. And now the question is, how do you actually make this scale across the sector? And financial institutions, one thing is, of course, the risk mitigation aspect, but the other one is, how do I make these decisions, my lending decisions, on a daily basis in a way that's actionable, that my loan officer can actually understand and make a lending decision too, right? How can they understand what is a sustainable farmer versus not? And I think this is where some of the things that we have started to do together under the Good Growth Partnership can be foundations for the future. And I'm thinking in particular, the map of biodiversity that we're doing together with the Smithsonian Institution, right? Which would actually create the areas that are go for investment or no go for investment, that would provide a relatively straightforward framework for financial institutions and others to follow. So again, we have started, we have a long way to go, but going at it together is the only way forward. Back to you, Simon.
Thank you, Tanya. Simplicity out of complexity, always difficult to create. Carlos Manuel, over to you for the final 3-minute contribution. What have you thought of what you've heard from your colleagues? And of course, you've got your own ideas about this as well, the integrated approach.
Well, thanks, Simon, and thanks to all for the different comments and sharing their experiences. Very compelling presentations. This partnership was jump-started in GF6 replenishment cycle. Now we're heading towards GF8. That context is extremely important because we at the GF has learned a lot out of this initiative, and that is why we're going from a few impact program to a very ambitious set of 11 impact programs in GF8 replenishment, saying with this that the integrated approach and building synergies within all programs, it is crucial. Here, we're not just dealing with a market failure and a supply chain issue. Also, I want to remind everybody that we're dealing with an institutional failure. Well, if we tend to believe that we will do the leap forward in terms of our sustainability objectives, the 2030 agenda and the climate and biodiversity targets with the same institutional framework that in first place has created the problem that today we want to fix, we got a big issue on ourselves. So one topic that for me is very clear with the good growth partnership is that in this new phase, we need to really help countries move from these institutional, working on sectors and in silos, and be able to understand that we need to create institutions that works at the landscape level. You know, when I was a minister, I always had my political targets with the Minister of Finance, but I always had my eyes over my shoulder because the Minister of Agriculture will always come through my blind side with a set of very aggressive policies that goes against what I was pulling for. And that is something which is extremely important in the context of GF8. We will never be able to upscale and amplify what we've been doing so far if we don't have the ministers of agriculture in the center of this process. It is time for us, to help the ministers of environment do that transition towards the ministers of agriculture, because at the end of the day, this is what will give us the possibility to go beyond the commodities that we're working and go beyond the geographies that we work in. Unfortunately, the ministers of agriculture are not there in terms of their academic preparation and their mindset. So how do we engage them on this? I got a couple of ideas which are very important. One is we need to continue investing in our jurisdictional approach and creating clean policies for sustainable production and land use. And let me give you an example of where we are with respect to this topic in terms of policy development. Well, I'm from Costa Rica, and when I see the Costa Rican national football team playing, it gets to my nerve to see the coach playing very conservative and playing defense. This is what we are doing. We're playing defense. We need to go from defense to offense. Be very proactive, be very aggressive using the science and the knowledge and the institutions to change the systems from the top down in this context with regards to the policy frameworks and the institutional frameworks. Here's where one element for me is clear and important in the next GF8. We need to really have at the country level information on land use capacity. We need to know at this needed scale, which are the suitable best soil for agriculture and which are the marginal soils. Unless we got that, and then we put layers of information on top of that. One basic layer is land use, actual land use. Know if the forest, where the forests are located or where the natural ecosystems are located. When you got that information, you got the right data for a dialogue with the Minister of Agriculture and agree on land use management. Then the second element is to narrow the gap within technology and data. Many countries have a lot of data, but they don't have the technology. We need to have state-of-the-art technology on land use and land use change. That is what will help countries do the oversight on those political agreements on landscape management within environmental and agricultural agencies. And my final point is that as you have the information on land use capacities, you can take brave, bold decisions like banning land use change in those soils which are not suitable for agriculture. This is what we did in Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, we banned land use change where you got forest, you need to keep that forest, but at the same time, we created positive incentive by putting a tax on fossil fuels and the development of the payment for environmental services, where we began paying farmers or owners of forests the cost of opportunity of doing cattle ranching. So we began dealing with the market failure. If we are able to fully include carbon payments in the productive landscapes at the land level, you will attract the interest of the agricultural sector, the Minister of Agriculture, and you will begin talking of climate adaptation, climate resilience, local PES programs, and narrowing down the big vision gap that we have within agriculture and environment. These are things that we are ripe for that. And I look forward to engage and continue supporting in GEP8 this alliance with these visions out of the many very positive learned lessons that we have gone in the last 3-4 years. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Carlos Manuel. So a recommendation there to move from defense to offense. We have a football team, I'm in the UK, we have a football team 10 miles down the road from me, which is vegan. All of its kit is made out of recycled fishing nets, and everybody expects them to lose hand over fist, and they don't. They're going up the league, and they're owned by a man who runs a renewable electricity company. So that's definitely going on to offense rather than defense. How do the rest of the panel see that? Well, it is a mindset change, going into competition. We'll spend 5 minutes on this before we move to questions from the audience, so do keep putting your questions in the Q&A. Who wants to give their definition of moving from defense to offense to back up what Carlos Manuel said? Don't all rush at once. Sanjayan, do you want to say something? Ulrika?
No, I think it's Ulrika, and I was just giving thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
I'm all for it.
I have digital hands.
I'm behind whatever Carlos Manuel wants to do.
Ulrika, how did that strike you?
No, but really interesting. And Carlos Manuel, and I was kind of smiling when you shared what your experience in government. And I mean, having worked in the Swedish government on the other side of the Atlantic, I mean, certainly recognize also and having more or less the same experience, how to relate also to the other colleagues and ministries in government, and how we could then use, I mean, as I was alluding to, also our worldwide network also to find those best practices where we can showcase that this actually works, both in the global north and in the global south, as we have to. Yeah, I think that also this kind of whole of government, whole of society approach, if we can use also some of the processes that we have ahead of us. And of course, I'm thinking about the work that we're doing now also with the NDCs. And if we could have some of these important decisions now taken onwards to work as umbrella strategies also for the work that we're doing, and get this experience into that kind of broader even umbrella strategy with regard to the implementation of the NDCs, and perhaps also combined with some of the other work that is taking place from a country perspective, but still building these experiences onwards and root them and have them related to some of the high level processes. I'm really keen to see you, just to mention, UNDP is working with technical support to 118 member states, developing now the hopefully increased ambition. And we're doing that also while we don't see enough of perhaps promises with regard to emission reductions. It's a much more inclusive process, speaking once again to the whole of society approach that we've seen across many different countries. So we should really make full use of this also, and look at other processes where we can kind of get in with this experience from the partnership and build something that can be even bigger out of this. Thank you. Nick and Eric, just quickly before we move to questions. Nick, you first.
Well, I wanted to try and answer this, but also to pick up on a comment that Gaurav tabled. I think, Sanjay, he wanted you to answer it, but I have a thought. Look, I think uncovering risk is a key element in fostering the changes we need across the supply chain, and you need different types of data in order to lay out the risk in a manner which is compelling to each of the actors. But we've also got to be cognizant that as we press buttons based on risk, you're going to be creating conditions where some of the more risk-averse actors may actually choose to invest elsewhere in less risky environments. And this was the question that Gaurav put. Are we in danger of undermining our own efforts in the process? And it's actually quite interesting, because if you look at cocoa, There are efforts underway now. It's still an experiment in the desert in the US, okay, to cultivate cocoa and to use greenhouses and humidifiers in the greenhouses to ferment the cocoa beans. And of course, I mean, look, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, right? In the desert, there's already a water shortage and everything else, but there are some benefits if it could work. And this is the key issue. I don't know whether that's likely to take off or not, but if it did, what would be the impact in terms of smallholder cocoa cultivation in West Africa? And what would be the impact, not just on livelihoods and poverty and everything else, but what would be the impacts on the environment? And this is why, as we do this, we've really got to take a global perspective. We've got a systems perspective. We've got to look forward to the changes coming around the corner. As difficult as the issues are that we face today, the changes in the future are going to bring new demands and new issues that we need to address. And this is just one example.
Thanks, Nick. Eric, quick point from you before we move to questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. Nick raises a very important issue there. I would take another, though, dimension of the going on offense one, which is the notion of the private actors. You know, historically, the idea of Milton Friedman was, you know, do no harm and then make as much money as you can. Don't pay attention to what society needs or stakeholder views. I think the going on offense today, the realization is that's actually a fallacy, that actually understanding the stakeholder view, including the needs of communities, of your clients, of other stakeholders, actually is good business practice. So I think actually, and Ulrika mentioned NDCs, understanding a government's priorities and how to deal with a global challenge like climate change actually is looking to be good business. And I think, Simon, your example that you described it with your football team, you know, the way you describe it, it sounds kind of quirky and niche. And that's often how these things start. You know, there was a car company called Tesla, which was, you know, as quirky as you could get. Nobody's laughing at Tesla any longer. So I think going on offense is understanding what society needs, understanding the big issues, and understanding how your business can contribute to addressing the problem, not just preventing harm.
Thank you. I should just apologize for being culturally insensitive. It's a soccer team, not a football team. But anyway, over to Pascal, my colleague, who's going to take us through the question session. And thank you to everybody in the audience that's been putting questions forward. Pascal, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon, and thanks to the panel. Great discussion up to now. So we have a few questions and I've selected a couple. I hope we have the time to do that couple of questions. So the first one is to Dr. Sanjayan from Gaurav Gupta. You mentioned about the pressure on the companies to clean their supply chains. Don't you think that pressure on the companies are also making them extremely risk averse and pushing them to source from low risk geographies, leaving the high-risk geographies exposed to further deforestation by companies that have no or low sourcing standards? And I would say, Dr. Sanjayan, when you're done, I would also ask Nick Sekran to address this question because it's very much about the demand side. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Pascal. And both Nick and Eric both alluded to this for sure. You know, you have to hold companies to a pretty high standard, but it is in our, you know, we launched a fund with Apple earlier this year called the Restore Fund. It's a $200 million fund to reforest, you know, parts of the world and do forestry in sort of the right way. So there's a return in terms of financial return, but there's also a carbon return, you know, wrapped into it. That fund limits the amount of funding that we could provide to North America. It actually says we can't put all the money in projects in North America. And it kind of forces the hand a little bit to take some risk and to invest in countries that where risk is generally high. So it's a very, very good point. So when you're working with global companies, you do have to understand their operating practices. This Liberia example is perfect. The company we met with there originally is a good company. I would say in the palm oil sector is seen as a decent actor, but ultimately the handcuffs were too strong for them to find a way to operate. Now, having said that, we should not automatically assume that regional or local companies are automatically bad. In fact, if you really think about this example, the big challenge we have in the long run is to really sort of figure out what the is to help understand what the Liberians themselves want for their forests. Right, so all of our premise, right, whether we live in the north or the south, our premise is that people will make decisions in their own enlightened self-interest. But that word enlightenment is really important. So, it isn't true to think automatically if it's an Indonesian company or a Liberian company or a Nigerian company that these are going to be automatically, bad actors. In fact, I think it's a very, very dangerous thing to do that, because you end up with ultimately very, very silly sort of ideas about good companies and bad companies. And there's incredible duplicity in that. Because if you really look at what happens in the UK or in Norway or in the United States, and you just go a little bit under the skin, you realize that we've done a really, really bad job of protecting our own environment. So I think that one of the things that we ought to do, Good Growth Partnership, Jeff, the CI, WWF, UNDP, etc., is really think about how to build that local voice and coalition that ultimately will help self-determine the kinds of companies they want to operate in their own space. We talk a lot about China, right? So one thing I think most of us agree on, China's own impact on its own country is actually fairly progressive. The thing that we worry about is China's investment outside of China. Typically, that's what we worry about. It's the same thing is true for really any of the other countries out there. We need to do a much better job of figuring out how to empower Liberians to have a voice in their own, in their own conservation, development, and sustainability plans.
Pascal, I think you called on me. I've sort of partly answered the question already and provided a case study in terms of cocoa, but I'd like to make 2 points. And first, we have to look at how best we target impact and who should be the focus of intervention. Our data show that some 25% of producers, the bottom 25% of producers, judged in terms of efficiency, how well they use land, labor, and so on and so forth, have 50% of the impacts we're trying to address and generate just 10% of the product. So we're looking at really at the bottom of the chain. These are the companies we don't like to work with as WWF, and I'm sure Conservation International and the UN system and IFC and so on and so forth. On the other hand, those are the companies we really need to target. So that's one point. The second is just looking at the good guys, and I think it is a really good point, Gaurav, and I sympathize with it. I think we're putting too much sometimes onto the shoulders of companies. They cannot address these issues working alone. And I think this is where the Good Growth Partnership has shown the value of these platforms that are being created, and the imperative of having tailor-made policies at the country level, which address some of the externalities beyond the reach of companies and their supply chains, especially when you're dealing with a very complex supply chain, which is very hard to manage. And I think that's where the Jeff, Carlos, making a major contribution, has made further major contribution to make, obviously through the Jeff partnership and with countries, and to ensure the alignment on policies. And here again, it is not the average policy that you need. The policies on different country to country, and the circumstances country to country are different, and they need to be tailor-made.
Maybe I can just chime in here, because I fully agree with Nick with what you said, and I would add that companies also respond to demand. So the part of the Good Growth Partnership that was focusing on addressing the changes in demand is really important, right? If sustainability becomes the ticket to play as opposed to a nice to have, that's how you actually start to change behavior all of the companies in the sector. And then the second driver, as you also said, is policy. And here I think policy is not just from the agricultural side, it's also policy of how you're regulating your financial sector. And many of you might be aware, actually the whole green credit policy idea was born in China, maybe about a decade ago, but now this is something that we as IFC are trying to help spread and help the bank regulators across the world actually exchange experiences about how they're going to regulate their financial sectors so that they lend for basically, for green credits. As of today, that network actually has 43 countries, but frankly, it's thin in Africa. So if one thing we could do more of is actually have other countries in Africa join the network, so that we can learn a lot about the green taxonomies that countries like Indonesia are putting together, like Paraguay, like Brazil, because this is one way of actually localizing some of the decisions that you want your own financial sector to be taking, but also learning from others in terms of good practices, right? So if we can continue the pressure on the demand side and on the regulatory side, eventually that's what creates the level playing field and the transparency.
Thank you, Sanjay, Nick, and Tanya. I don't think, unfortunately, that we have time for further questions. I'm going to pass back to Simon for the closing question and the wrap-up. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Pascal. Very efficiently run, and thanks to all the participants for the quick updates they gave us there. Those of you who've got questions that are so far unanswered, what we'll try and do is collect those and see if we can answer them in email later on, rather than trying to put them into the hour. But as all of you in Indonesia will know, it's nearly 10 o'clock at night, so we're trying to honour your evening rather than carry on too long. So let's conclude now just with a minute from each of the panelists, and we're asking about the future, really. What's needed to take this approach to the next level? So just a minute each. If you had to do one thing between now and 2030, what might it be? Tanya, why don't you kick us off with that one?
Actually, I think under the GEF7, we already have part of the answer, right? Because we're expanding the work of the Good Growth Partnership to 8 commodities and more than 20 countries, and trying to do more of this, but broader. And then beyond that, I actually also want to go back to the point Nick made earlier about data. I think we have a lot to do together to put data out there, data about business cases, data about what works, data about what companies are doing using the satellite imagery. And there's a huge power in our ability to do that. And that will also help to create a level playing field for the private sector. Thanks.
Data, Nick, that was your topic. What would your 1-minute summary be?
I think we need to deal with the laggards, and traders are a special category. And we've not been able to find a solution yet, and because the traders tell us they work on very low margins, 1.5 to 3%, and the very nature of commodities, that they're non-distinguishable, mean that there are significant costs associated with getting the traders to move to sustainability. How do we peel off at least one of them, though, and to show the way forward? And I think it's revealing that Bunge, which is the only publicly traded entity in the trader community, 98% of their shareholders recently voted to get out of deforestation, and that is completely unprecedented. So I think we have an opportunity to work with them to establish how best to do it. Thank you.
Dr. Sanjan, you next.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm excited about is a recent piece of work we ended up doing with Walmart and other partners. We went to Walmart and essentially took 13 of their top commodities and traced it back to land and water to basically ask, what is the impact these commodities are having and where is that impact most felt? It turns out that for many companies, retail companies, but also companies that really do source from particular places, they don't, even though they have lots and lots of data on supply chains. I mean, they make a living by maximizing sort of efficiency on supply chain. They don't actually know the impact of the things that they are commonly using on landscapes. They don't really know exactly where the opportunities lie, etc. So that was an incredibly revealing study for both us and for our colleagues at Walmart. And it pointed the way to them to then make an investment in particular landscapes where they felt that their supply chain was heavily dependent upon, but also where they could see some impact. That kind of model where we help companies or work with companies to really understand the land and water and ocean impacts of their supply chains, and then drive their commitments to not just cleaning up their supply chain, but also investing in those particular landscapes, say North Sumatra, for example, I think is a key step.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Eric, how's the UN e-finance initiative look for the future?
Yeah, I think the future is about, I mentioned impact before. You can't assess impact without data. So I think to the points that Tanya and Nick have raised, Very importantly, in a couple of weeks, a task force on nature-related financial disclosures will launch. Really important development. Very pleased to be working with UNDP and WWF and others in development of that. The hope is to try to provide consistent measures for how you do disclosures related to nature-related risks and opportunities. The food system will be one of the most important sectors that will be looked at. We hope that through better data, you have more private initiative. But I think very importantly, part of what we discussed today, it's this dance between the private sector doing things voluntarily and regulators and policymakers. It's not for one to wait, to sit back and wait for the other to act. It's the dance of raising ambition together. And it's not about doing a sideshow, doing one transaction and showing it off. It's about everything that we do. That all has to be part of the dance.
Great mental image. Carlos, where will you be dancing in the next 10 years?
Well, first, Simon, I strongly believe that we need to be very successful in having a very good GF replenishment. We have a programming objective proposal that is extremely ambitious, and it is based on the fact that two big barriers need to be overcome. One is the lack of policy coherence at the country level. We invest many more times, and Nick was the first one to brought this to my attention when he was working at UNDP doing the financial analysis of the New York Declaration for Forests. I think it was 2017. It was an eye-opener to me when Nick told us that we are investing 150 times more resources in activities that generates deforestation than what we are investing in the forest conservation, and 80% of that comes from the agricultural sector. So policy coherence is extremely important. And in order to generate more policy coherence, we need to have the right institutional framework. So I asked myself, Simon, if we got such a huge policy gap within environment, people, and agriculture, what is the reasons behind it? And I don't get it, because the ministers of agriculture, they work with domesticated biodiversity. The ministers of environment, they work with wild biodiversity in the same landscapes, using the same natural resources and with the same stakeholders. So why do we have such a big, huge gaps? So dealing with that policy coherence is important. The other element is that we need to help countries mobilize more efficiently domestic resources. The system change cannot rely just on increased financial support from ODA or even private sector. 80% of what we invest today in nature conservation and climate change come from public expenditures, public resources. This is where we need to aim for more efficiency and more coherence. If we're able to do that, the rest will come on in the right direction. So I believe that yes, as we bring out deforestation out of the supply chain, we need to understand that at the end of the day, and Sanjan said it very well, he's not concerned about what happens in China, he's concerned about the demand that generates China, the US, and Europe. But we don't see the need to really work on the alignment of policies at the country level that can create the enabling conditions at the end of that line, so the whole system is totally is responding to our sustainability objectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Ulrika, last word to you.
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and thanks, everyone. A lot of food for thought. I mean, also relating to some of the things that have been said, I believe that working upstreams with regard to finance is important, and UNDP has, and Eric, you spoke to our partnership as well, but also with others here, some really interesting offers. I believe that the Secretary General and his working group for the Global Investors for Sustainable Development, they actually need some concrete ideas on their table. It's a lot of talk, but more action needed, and certainly to drive investments to the least developed countries and even some middle income economies. So there I would like to offer also, and UNDP also being part of, or actually having the technical secretariat for the G7 group on sustainable finance as well, could be interesting platforms for us actually to take some of these discussions into these, because they are looking for new ways of working. Also, of course, policy coherence and that kind of whole of government, whole of society approach. How do we get there, and what kind of best practices do we see in different countries that we could build on? And it has to do a lot of with of course data, as we have alluded to many times in this discussion, but working also on communication and advocacy. I would say that we need also to look at our ways of addressing different audiences in different ways. So of course then working with what I was appreciating, I think the ways of communicating by the partnership. I mean, there's yet more to be done there, how to address different audiences and how to incentivize then these different actors, whether they are in government or the broader set of society actors, to get them on board, and would be happy also to come up with some ideas where we are also developing UNDP's new ways of addressing also the silent middle of people actually who need to support decision makers taking these difficult decisions sometimes and explain them. So that's also an offer from UNDP's side as we are developing new ways of working with regard to advocacy.
Thank you. There is this sort of whole of government thought, but also the joins between the different bits of government that we've somehow got to get into. And you often hear UNDP saying 170 officers working with 170 governments around the world. But of course, it's the interministerial thing as well as the whole government thing that we need to perfect. Well, thank you all. That's the last of our high-level panels. Great look into the future there for the integrated approach. Thanks to our production team who've been beavering away in the background, Aileen, Ilaria, Lavinia, and our interpreters, Kathy and Hedwig. And thanks to Pascal for looking after the question session. Now, if you haven't had enough, our final session, a training session rather than a high-level panel, coming up in 4 hours for those who want to learn about systemic leadership for change makers. Now, I've worked with the trainers who are running that session from Leadership Coefficient. They really are excellent. So if you're still around in 4 hours' time, do log into that. Full details on the Green Commodities Community platform. So if it's 10 a.m. where you are, see you at 2. If it's 10 p.m. where you are, thanks for staying up with us and sleep well. Full details of everything that you will want to follow up afterwards from our Good Growth Conference are on the Green Commodities Community digital platform. So have a good rest of your day, rest of your evening, whatever it might be for you. And thanks to you, the audience, and thanks to all the participants. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.